Hello, listeners. Thank you for joining us today. I am your host, Elise Trudel-Cedeno, and I'm joined today by my wonderful friend, Rebecca Davis. Rebecca is an instructor at Murray State College in Tishomingo, Oklahoma, and a Ph.D. student at the University of Swansea and University of Central Oklahoma. Along with first-year writing courses, she teaches Introduction to Folklore, Introduction to Literature, English Literature, and creative writing. Her research interests include fantasy literature, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, fanfiction, corpus linguistics and digital humanities, fairy tales, and young adult literature. Outside of the academic sphere, Rebecca is a member of the production team for the Prancing Pony Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, where she serves as Barliman and answers listener questions. She also happens to be extremely fond of tea and puns.
It's perhaps too fond.
Perhaps a little, but we appreciate it and we love you for it.
Oh, thanks.
Any good ones to start us off? Any good puns to start us off today?
Oh gosh, see, and that's the thing. I'm never really good at it doing it on the spot.
There you go. Yeah,
I do have a really niche Tolkien one.
Okay, I'm ready.
So how many oars did Idril have in the boat with her when she sailed back to Valinor?
7 for the Dwarf Lords? I don't know.
No, just 2 oar.
Bottom. All right. Insert drum riff here. I love it. Of course, it's Idril. What was I thinking?
that one, yeah, that one's probably really, really niche.
But amongst the people that we tend to work with,
yeah, they get it.
They get it. So it's not as niche as perhaps we think it is. All right, so we shared a little bit about what subjects you teach, but can you describe your subjects, the work that you do, for those who may be unfamiliar with your discipline? What is it exactly that you do teach?
Okay, well, first year writing is essentially the most basic forms of essays and other types of writing that will be done in undergrad programs. So we're not getting super fancy as far as doing literature reviews and research projects. It's going to be things like, how do you explain a concept, or how do you present an argument on a position? Your pretty basic standard stuff that students can then grow from and build on. Literature classes, these are typically for the level I teach, they're typically introductory. So we're just kind of skimming the surface and introducing the students to those subjects. And then survey courses, it's going to cover a broad range rather than just a single author. The purpose for both of them is to give students a general idea of how to read literature, as well as some of the cultural backgrounds that produce the literary works we're studying.
So this is very general, very first year entry into university.
Yes. So the college I currently teach at, we are a 2-year community college. So for the majority of our students, they're going to continue on with their undergraduate at a 4-year institution. So we just get them started.
Right. Sort of bridging the gap between high school and
exactly
having college preparatory, like learning how to essentially read and write for a college or a university class.
Exactly. And I mean, the goal is kind of the opposite of Gandalf and the Balrog. And I'm saying you shall pass.
Excellent. But not without trial. And
yes. And
I was about to make a joke about the whips, but that's probably inappropriate. Let's let that edit.
I still can't read that line without just snorting. And it's like, thank you, Alan and Sean.
Like, really? So which fantasy and pop culture stories do you typically use in your teaching? How do you bridge the gap between the fictional content and your subject area, particularly in this introductory level?
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm going to be completely honest. It's really hard to do with the first year writing courses, because the majority of your work is writing. But for my Intro to Folklore course, I really like to take familiar stories. Most students have heard of Zeus and other Greco-Roman myths, thanks to Disney's Hercules. And especially now in today's society, the Percy Jackson series, that has been great as far as like, oh yeah, I know that story.
Yeah.
But I also really like to bring in less known myths from cultures that haven't received as much attention, not only in the grade school curriculum, but by Hollywood and, you know, our other media producers. So I like to pull in Irish mythology, which that is fantastic. I mean, I always love teaching the class on the story of Macha and her race and how she curses the men of Ulster, because it's just like, it's like, Hera, that is how you lay a curse.
Yes.
But like, for example, there is a really fantastic animated miniseries on Netflix called Maya and the Three that I've used to explore Aztec mythology in my intro to folklore class.
Nice.
It's fantastic. I cannot recommend it enough. And it's just, I love it. It's so enjoyable. I don't want to spoil, and it's really hard for me to say like why you need to watch it without spoiling it. So I'll just leave that there. But in my literature classes, I will admit I have a bias in that I managed to work in at least one of Tolkien's works in every class.
But of course.
So, yeah, it's like, oh, I have to. I'm a Tolkien scholar. And it's kind of become a joke with some of my students.
Yeah.
So what of Tolkien's are we reading this semester? I have taught Fellowship of the Rings and the story of Turin and Turambar in my intro to literature class and my world literature classes. We most recently we were comparing the story of Turin and Turambar as we were reading Tolkien's the Kullervo or Kullervo. Sorry, I want to make sure I get my pronunciation right there. But I've got an upcoming British Lit class where we're going to be looking at British literature since the 19th century through the lens of fantasy.
Okay.
And we're going to be using George MacDonald's Fantasties, Return of the King, got to get my Tolkien in. And then we're going to move from that into Diane Wynne Jones' Howl's Moving Castle and finish up with Neil Gaiman's Stardust.
Excellent choices.
Yeah, it was so hard to narrow it down, but it was like, and it's just like felt like I was cutting off limbs. I was going, full like cutting off my right hand to escape from Pengoradrim. As far as like, I can't teach all of Lord of the Rings. And it's like, but I want to do. But yeah, it's going to be quite the action-packed class, I think.
I'll bet. So why these particular texts? I mean, Tolkien, I understand because you're a Tolkien nerd. It's part of who you are. But what are some of the other texts that you chose that really speak to you and to your subject area?
Well, I will admit, like the main reason I picked Diane Wynne Jones and Howl's Moving Castle is that after Tolkien, she is one of my favorite authors. And I loved the Studio Ghibli film, even though there's similarities, but there's also some major differences.
Yeah.
And I wanted to take a non-traditional approach to British literature in teaching this class, because for the majority of the students, their literature classes and experiences of learning literature so far have primarily been, it's just, oh, well, we read this because every other generation has read this, and it's left them with the impression that literature is boring and it's not worth exploring. And they get so fixated on giving the right answer and doing the right reading. So one of the reasons I picked these texts is that not only do we see the kind of the influence from MacDonald to Tolkien, and then Tolkien on Jones, and Tolkien on Gaiman. So you see that progression, but these are stories I think will not only have students enjoy reading them, but it's also going to help them see how enjoyable stories can be studied and discussed. Fantasy literature, unfortunately, has been scoffed at as being literature worthy of being studied. But these are as we've seen from the last 20 years, fantasy stories are the stories that people enjoy the most. I mean, if you go into a movie theater in the last, or even on a streaming service, the last 10 years, there's fantasy titles have been dominating those areas. And I'd like to say, you know, we could probably trace that explosion back to the early 2000s and a release of a certain film trilogy. But yeah, so I mean, you see the explosion in fantasy with the Lord of the Rings films being released, and it kind of ebbs a bit. And then 10 years later, 2012, you know, we have dun 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 dun, and Game of Thrones is on the scene, and everyone's talking about fantasy again. So that in itself, that tells me this is worth studying as far as what effect it's having on culture. And if that's part of the reasons I think we study literature, then that makes fantasy worthy of study.
100%. And if you're going to sit in a class and learn how to read, you might as well read something you enjoy.
Exactly. And I mean, it helps that 3 out of the 4 books we're going to be reading have films. So, and I'm not saying like that replaces the book, but for some learners, that can be such an important tool. Is can I have the story told to me in a different medium?
Yeah. Using like cross-media approaches is so important, because especially, you know, I've had students who needed to either see the film or listen to the text on audiobook. And
yeah.
And right now I'm listening to the radio drama of Lord of the Rings, and
oh, nice.
Listening to it hits differently than when you just read it with your eyes. You have to read it with your ears too, in some cases.
And I mean, that's especially true of Tolkien. Reading Tolkien silently, you miss out so much on the alliteration and just the beauty, the utter beauty of his prose. And yeah, it's one, like, I also made sure all of these books have really good audiobooks that go with them. So it just incorporates a new reading experience, I think.
Absolutely. And for some kids, some students and some adults, that really matters, you know, having that cross-media outlet, having that input from different modes, you know, sometimes that's how that gets the synapses firing. Absolutely.
Right.
What are some of the results that you see in your classroom when you use these texts? What connections have your students made with the subject material and the fantasy texts?
Well, when I taught fellowship, it was for a completely online asynchronous class. So that in itself definitely presented a challenge as far as interaction and live connections. But I do tend to do a final project where they have to, that's connected in some way with the book we were reading. So for fellowship, one of their options was they had to make one of the foods described in fellowship. So, and I gave them some examples. So they could have made Mrs. Maggot's mushrooms. They could have made Bilbo's farewell supper. What did they have to eat at Rivendell? But I had a lot of students who they're like, you know what, I'm going to make limbus. And I had a student and his mother who both got together, and apparently he didn't bake. He's a concurrent high school student, and they made limbus and took a picture of it, and they wrote a food blog of it. So seeing them connect that way was really cool. But as far as live classes, especially when I've been able to pull in mythology, there is often these light bulb moments that I see with students when they see the themes and motifs that appear in stories featuring elves and the fae folk and all the other denizens of fantasy, that they're like, wait a second, that's almost exactly like this story we were studying from ancient Greece or from ancient Babylon, or this reminds me of the story of Maui. And then that in turn gets them thinking about how they're connected by stories and by the storytelling tradition to folks hundreds and thousands of years before them. And you can just see like their mind going, and that it's when they have that that I think that's when they really get why it's important to study literature, even if you're not an English major, because it informs us about the human experience in a way that nothing else can.
Agreed. I gotta say, I'm loving the food because
it's always good.
when I taught my Hobbit course, I had a student who he got an unofficial Hobbit cookbook, and he made a whole slideshow of every single recipe that he tried out. And he said that the only thing that he did not like was cram.
I don't blame him.
I mean, and I told him it's basically like, I'm like, it's there. It's all it is nutritional value. It's the granola bar of Hobbit.
To be fair, there are some good granola bars.
Yeah, no, this is like the Nature Valley granola bar that crumbles in your pocket. Okay, this isn't like blah.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this last semester, I had a student in my world literature class who really, really liked the medieval literature we looked at. Nice. And they made a medieval meal. I mean, it was a saffron chicken and homemade bread, and they spit roasted the chicken. And it was like, the amount of effort of going above and beyond that I've seen when students get projects like this, they really connect with the material in a way that they don't by simply, write a response paper to this text. And it's like, okay. And I mean, that's always an option because you usually have at least one student who's like, I just want to write a paper. But they really love these projects.
Yes. Tapping into that creativity, whether that creativity is writing the paper or doing some kind of creative food blog or like
right. And I mean, when she told
roasting a chicken,
like she special ordered the saffron, and I was like, I okay. It was like, I really like
saffron's expensive.
I know. I was like, you didn't need to do that. Like, I was gonna say, like, next time I'll put like, do not spend any more than X amount on all of the ingredients.
The expense of your food does not equal an A+, but cool.
But I'm also glad you went to this much effort, and it really was great. She was happy to do it. She was like, I love cooking. And she's like, and it was really good. It was really good. So
clearly.
Yeah, fantastic chicken. That was some of the best chicken.
Like you've raised hobbits, Becca. You have raised hobbits now.
Yeah. And it's like they've all, I honestly think they all come away like, ooh, I really ought to have tea.
Yeah. Gotta have tea. Tea is good. Okay. So in your opinion, what is the value of fantasy? Why even bring it into the classroom? I mean, in our current world and in the world that perhaps you teach in, most people see college as a place to get a degree, just to learn the skills, to get a job, to get employment. So what would you say to someone who might ask you, okay, how is reading Tolkien or reading fairy tales going to get me a job?
Well, I mean, as far as reading Tolkien, his fans are many. We are legion. You never know who you might encounter and where you might encounter them in the wild.
This is very true.
But no, in all seriousness, why we need to study fantasy. I have to say, I really do agree with Tolkien in what he says on fairy stories, in that it provides escape, recovery, and consolation. Fantasy is a genre that it helps us escape, which we do from time to time. I mean, turn on the news any day and you've got tragedy and controversy and scandal, and that really does damage something in us. Hearing that over and over every day, we want to get away from it. Fantasy allows us to do that for just a moment, for just enough time to get that recovery, to just gather our sanity back, to live, to go to a world that, yes, in reality, the good guys don't always win. Sometimes the bad guys do. Sometimes the good guys lose. But how dark and depressing would it be if we couldn't escape to a world where, sometimes everything does work out perfectly, and everything that is, right the right thing always happens in the end. And no matter what the good guys go through, they win. It gives us that sense of hope that in a way it's its own little eucatastrophe. This unlooked for hope it's enough to keep us going. And it's that consolation that, okay, yeah, everything seems dark now in reality, but there's still hope for the future. Mm-hmm. That's the gift of fantasy. And in my experience, it's something that I haven't found in other literary genres or even other fictional genres.
Yeah.
But the value of studying literature, whether it's fantasy, whether it's historical fiction, whether it's science fiction, autobiography, any of that, even if you're not an English major, the value of studying literature is that it helps you to think critically and to consider things from other people's perspectives. And it helps to develop empathy, which I would argue is something that society in general today needs a lot of work on. I mean, it's totally fine to disagree with someone and to hold different positions and viewpoints. Even if you think someone is completely wrong, you think they are the worst person in the world, I think it's still part of being a decent human being to at least acknowledge there is something that's making them feel this way. And yeah, it might be, maybe they are just a terrible person. But what could have happened in their life? What could have been their experience that has made them feel this way? And I think when we do that, sometimes it does involve putting yourselves into an uncomfortable pair of shoes, but it does leave you having to consider, if I had been through the same experiences, would I react? Would I have a different position than what I do? Would I have that in common with them? So I think that's something fantasy allows us to do. And studying fantasy and studying literature is, it lets us consider things from another person's perspective.
Yeah.
And fantasy, though, I think does it in a way that is the most approachable and the most enjoyable for the student. I mean, who wouldn't like to be flying around on a broomstick, and I'm trying to think, not riding a wingless Balrog. I would rather hurt, but you get my point. It's right. Like, I think all of us, like, I know I would have loved to have, I still probably would love to have a little unicorn.
Yeah. I mean, I even now I have students who I have a student who loves horses, and she's like, Rohan, absolutely.
Yes. It's like, yes, I found my people.
Absolutely.
And it's like, I still, after it rains, if I see a fairy ring in the backyard, I still will not walk through it. It's like, I know I have to acknowledge, okay, yeah, that's fake. That's, folklore, but it's like, I don't know, you never.
But what if?
What if? And it's like, yeah, I know, like, this happens every time I see an old-fashioned wardrobe. It's like, it was the first time I read through Chronicles of Narnia as a kid, I did not pick up on the allegory at all.
Yeah.
So when I got to Last Battles, spoilers, I was so angry at Lewis because I was 11. I was thinking, I still had that,
yeah,
fantastical imagination starting to fade a little bit, but it was like, I could get my letter from Hogwarts. I could find a wardrobe.
Yeah.
And then Lewis destroyed Narnia.
Yep.
And then you get older and you're like, realize the allegory of it and everything. It's like, okay, all right, fine. I get it. Narnia's not really destroyed. But even today, it's like I see a wardrobe and it's like, I always like to open it and just like push aside the coats and just maybe. But yeah, exactly. And it just goes back to, I think, that desire for all of us. We want to escape.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's like we have a wanderlust for these worlds that we can't get to, but something in us is longing for those worlds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's like Tolkien said, it's not the escape from reality, it's the escape of the prisoner. The prisoner wants to get out of jail. The prisoner understands the jail still exists.
Yeah, it's like, let me just go away for just a little bit.
Yeah. Just have just a little bit of breath of fresh air. Come on, man.
I mean, it's like using Tolkien as the example. It's like in Fellowship when we get the break in Lothlorien. I mean, they know once they leave Lothlorien, Gandalf is still dead.
Yep.
They still have to destroy the ring, and Sauron's enemy or Sauron's forces. Because I realized, wait, they're Sauron's enemies. The bad guys are still out there to get them.
Yeah.
But they get this brief layover in Faerie, in Lothlorien, where they don't have to think about that stuff for just a little bit.
Yeah.
And it gives them that oomph, that second wind to, okay, let's, shoulder my pack and let's go.
With a little bit of rope, real elvish rope.
Yep. And, some salt for some roast chicken.
Yum.
Throw in a little movie.
Yeah, that's a little movie reference. But see, that's just it, though. The cross media, once again.
Exactly.
Once again, I love it.
It gets really fun, though, teaching Fellowship. If you want to see who has not read the book, you always throw in a quiz question about Tom Bombadil. What color are Tom Bombadil's boots? Actually, I did have a student who wrote back to me. It's like, who is that? And their response.
Check the chapters.
Yes, in the house of Tom Bombadil.
It's right there.
Yeah,
it's right there. Even my 10-year-olds know who Tom Bombadil is now.
I know, and it's just like, love him or hate him, he's there.
He's there, exactly.
You have to. You cannot say you've experienced Tolkien until you've experienced Tom Bombadil.
Just the absolute nuttiness that is Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
And even some of my students are like, why wasn't he in the movies? I'm so sad. I'm like, oh, you're good children. You're good children.
But I mean, who knows? I've heard some rumorings on the interwebs that he might be in Rings of Power season 2. Fingers crossed. We might finally get our Tom Bombadil portrayal apart from the Soviet Lord of the Rings.
Oh God. I showed my students, I said, guys, you have to see Gandalf in the Soviet Lord of the Rings. And they just
riding the eagle.
Riding the eagle. They just died. They absolutely died. Oh my gosh. Listeners, if you have not seen the Soviet Lord of the Rings, go to YouTube right now and find it, because you will crack up laughing. It's insane.
It's so good. It's bad.
It's so good. It's
so
bad.
It's good.
Exactly. It's both. It's
the elves of movies. Both yes and no.
Both yes and no. And apparently in Lothlorien, you have some kind of acid trip.
Yeah. and then like the eye of Sauron is like an eye floating in red Kool-Aid. But hey, I do have to say, I thought their portrayal of Lobelia Sackville Baggins was spot on.
That was brilliant. We don't get enough Lobelia Sackville Baggins.
We don't. And her parasol and her stolen spoons. I know Jeff LaSala is coming up with some kind of murder mystery for Lobelia Sackville Baggins to solve. Perfect. She's like the Shire's version of Miss Marple.
Yes. 100%. She is.
Like an evil Angela Lansbury.
Yes.
Oh, my God.
Oh, I love it. Okay. If you could choose any character. Oh, I just realized. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I included this question as this is an on the spot kind of. I'm so sorry. If you could choose any character in any fantasy or pop culture story to be your teacher, who would you choose?
Okay.
Yeah, on the spot.
Okay. Well, the off-color comment would be, what are they teaching me?
That's the question too.
Oh gosh. I feel like I should say Gandalf, but I'm not.
Yeah.
And yes, my answer is going to come from Lord of the Rings, and I am going to say Elrond.
Okay. Tell me why.
Well, he is one of my favorite characters, like in my top one. Mithras is one of the other ones, but for other reasons. Has to do with the meaning of his name. But for Elrond, and the reason I think he would be a phenomenal teacher, this is a character who has literally been through hell.
Yeah.
I mean, whether you fall on, the blame his parents and Maglor and Mithras were, his real parents, or not, which I fall on the not, because it's like they kidnapped them. They are literally the reason that Elros and Elrond had no parents. He goes through losing both sets of parents, both his mom and dad and his foster parents / kidnapped dads, to use the fandom term.
Quite.
So that's a big trauma. And then he and his brother are presented his twin brother. And seriously, what does fantasy literature have against twins? He and his twin brother are presented with a choice of, do you want to be human or do you want to be an elf? And his twin brother chooses to be counted among the humans.
Yeah.
So, and seriously, that's another thing of, I wish Tolkien had told us why they made the choices they did.
Yeah.
And even though Elros had that super extended life, Elrond still has to go through losing his brother. And I've had to go through that as well. And it's a terrible pain. And it's a pain while it gets better, it never fully goes away. There is still always that hole. And I can only imagine what that hole would have been like for someone who is thousands of years old. And I mean, he literally knows, I'm never going to see my brother again until Arda is remade. The literal end of the world.
Yeah.
So then he loses, Gil-galad, his king and mentor and friend. So, yay.
Yeah.
And then he gets this little brief moment of happiness he meets Celebrian and I hope I said her name right, or a certain friend of mine is going to just ream me for my pronunciation.
Yeah.
They have kids, and then Celebrian has to leave because she gets attacked by orcs, and he, despite being one of the greatest healers in Middle Earth, he is not able to heal her, and the guilt he must have felt for that. And I promise there's a point. I'm reaching it.
I feel it. I got you. Don't worry.
And then Arwen falls in love with Aragorn and decides to make the choice of Luthien. And so, I mean, we don't find this out from the films. And this is another reason why for your listeners, the books, you miss out so much if you just watch the books, or if you just watch the books, if you just watch the films, because if you read the books, you find out that Elrond raised Aragorn as his foster son.
Yeah.
And there was a closeness there. And it's just like, so even if Aragorn and Arwen hadn't ended up together, Elrond would have had to have gone through the eventual loss of a child.
Yeah.
Like, oh, great. But he does have to go through Arwen, and has made the same choice as his brother. He's going to be separated from her for the rest of time until Arda's remade. I'm holding on to hope there. And we don't know what choice his sons make. Now, I will go to my grave saying that their grandfather Celeborn drugged them in the last ship with him, because I refuse to have Elrond lose all of his kids.
Yeah, that's just too much.
Yeah. But despite all of that loss, this is still a character who when Bilbo meets him, Elrond's described as being kind as summer. Now, all of that loss, I think, for most people, we would say it's justifiable if they became an absolute terrible person. Or at least not terrible, like they're doing bad deeds, but if they're just like, I don't like being around them, they're a downer.
Yeah.
No, Elrond focuses on he is a healer, he is a counselor, and just the amount of, I don't know if it's grace or just it is wisdom in a sense to deal with life and all those griefs and not go insane. That's why I think he would be the best teacher, and to still be able to be described as being kind, because that's something I aspire to be described as. Like, I would love to inspire a character and they say, and she was kind as summer, and it's like, oh, thank you.
I'll write it on your tombstone.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
It's so true. I mean, in addition to being one of the wisest lore masters in the world, he's seen some stuff. So
exactly.
he's wise in so many different ways, not just in the books, but also in life.
Yeah. And I mean, if I can just like throw in like the next, like one other, probably Faramir.
Faramir would be pretty cool. I feel like Faramir would be good for a book club, though. Like, I want to be in a book club with him.
I want to take literature classes from Faramir. And this is probably why it's a good thing he was not sent to Rivendell, because he would have just been nerding out the entire time. Fangirling, like, oh, I'm meeting Glorfindel.
Oh my God.
And it's like, oh my gosh, oh, Lord Elrond, oh, he shook my hand.
I'm never washing this hand again.
And it's just like, he'd see the shards of Narsil and just faint.
Yeah. and Denethor would be watching from afar going, you parasite.
Yes.
Wizard's pupil.
Yes, wizard's pupil. And it's like, Faramir would be writing home, well, do you wish that, Boromir's and my place had been exchanged?
And Denethor would be like, nope, you're fine. Stay where you are. Stay where you are in Rivendell.
Oh, man. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, Denethor is not winning Parent of the Year.
No, although, I mean, in his defense, book Denethor is a lot more sympathetic and understandable than film Denethor. Like, he's still a terrible person, but his actions are slightly more understandable. Now, if it comes to who do I want me to teach me, Elvish traditions, definitely be Mr. Hot Ginger. With a name like that.
I love it.
All right. Anyway, thank you for the
anyway.
Seriously though, finding out that's what Maedhros's name meant was why I went back and actually finished reading the Silmarillion.
Hot Ginger, I love it.
Yes. The Silmarillion, come for the talking dog and the badass female heroine, stay for the hot ginger.
Now that's a movie tagline if I've ever heard it. Oh gosh. So Rebecca, do you have any upcoming projects or publications that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I do. So I have a chapter called Perilous and Fair, Nature Enchanted in Lothlorien that is coming. It's being included in an upcoming book called Cities and Strongholds of Middle-earth that's being published by the Mythopoeic Press, projected to be published sometime this year or early next year. So really excited about that. And I'm also revamping and updating my own website, The Writer. So not like, but like with a pen and quill and all that, thewriterofrohan.com. And that website, it's got some commentary on some of my favorite Tolkien characters and the story, updates on my PhD research, which I'm looking at the depiction of Tolkien's female characters in fan fiction. And just other musings, and potentially I've got a small little podcast or YouTube show of my own in the works that we'll know for sure if that's going to work out sometime this summer.
Sweet.
So yeah, kind of like, oh gosh, I've got a lot on my plate, but it's like, it's a big plate.
Thank goodness
I have a
Hobbit
size plate.
Yes. Oh, thank goodness for Hobbit plates.
Yes. Bomber would approve of the size of my plate.
Indeed. If we wanted to follow you on social media, where could we follow you on social media, or do you have a website?
I do. And I want to make I do have the Writer of Rohan. And I'll have a link to that up on my Twitter. And I just want to make sure I give you guys my Twitter handle. I feel really old. It's like, oh wait, what is my Twitter handle?
Yeah.
So you can find me at Twitter at Becca. So that's BECCAH Davis, DAVIS. Best place to reach out and follow along. And I will apologize in advance for the puns, which do happen more frequently there.
You don't apologize for the puns. You have entire panels on your puns.
I do.
Okay.
I do. I have the PPP Discord has given me my very own Becca no reaction button for my puns, which that is honestly, I am prouder of that than I was of my master's diploma.
I mean, that's a crowning achievement to get your own sticker in the Discord.
Exactly. And it's like, I think what aced it was my asking about, or telling people rather, Numenor had a retirement community on a separate island. When those folks reached a certain age, they were sent away from Numenor to the retirement community on Old Menor. But
and slam the door.
I always get so many door slams.
Oh, yes. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your other favorite podcast feeds. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a rating and a review as well. You can read and find out more about Teaching with Magic by visiting our website, teachingwithmagic.blog. You can leave a message on our podcast page, read past Teaching with Magic posts, and check out our book lists on our affiliate page. We also invite you to support us on Patreon. You'll have access to bonus material, our Discord channel, live Q&As, and you'll get a sneak peek at future products such as lesson plans, worksheets, and other teaching tools. The link is always available in our show notes and the podcast page on our website. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, keep making magic.